All right, we're live. Good morning, everybody. Welcome, welcome. If you've never been to a Notion office hours, pretty stoked to have William Nutt on today. I know we've had him in the past doing some formula stuff, and we get so many questions about relations and rollups with databases, and I think this is really some of the magic of Notion. So today, William Nutt is going to walk us through the basics, possibly some advanced features too, I'm sure. We're going to go through all of that. So William, super excited. Thank you for joining me today.
Yeah, pleasure to be here once again, Marie. Thank you.
This is fun. It's easy for us to get pretty nerdy about Notion. So just some housekeeping. If you've never been to a session before, use the ask a question area below because William's going to kind of go through a little bit tutorial style. We're going to definitely leave questions at the end. If questions do pop up kind of as related to what you're talking about, I might kind of jump in and we'll try and address those as best we can. But we'll make sure to leave some time for Q&A so that we've clarified that. So welcome. Looks like we've got people from like everywhere. Switzerland, Calgary, Burbank, lots of Canadians, France. Very cool. Welcome, welcome. First time.
I saw Mexico in there.
So fun. So welcome. I'm super excited. Let's dive in. William, if you want to give us a little, a little intro about the session, kind of what people can expect. And
yeah, certainly. Well, thank you so much again for letting me join you again. It's always an enormous pleasure. So I am William Nutt. I run Nutt Labs, typically from New York, but I'm currently quarantining in North Carolina. Still, I was actually in North Carolina the last time I joined office hours. So TBD on when I can get back to the city, but the family time is nice. And we're kind of an integrated digital strategy firm and Notion consultancy, but I also run the website Notion VIP. And there I publish kind of tools and insights about all things Notion. So that's at notion.vip. And so as Marie said, we're going to be diving into relations and rollups today. And to your point, we will keep the detailed kind of step-by-step instruction kind of simpler so everybody can grasp the concepts, but we will look at some kind of more advanced implementations of relations and rollups so that folks can get a sense of really what they're capable of doing. So at the end of the session afterwards, we, of course, it will be recorded and it will be available on YouTube, probably within the next 24 hours or so. And to complement this material, there's a post on Notion VIP about relations and rollups, and that will probably be a helpful resource as you're implementing some of these practices on your own, because it dives in to a little bit more of the specifics and in a text format that will probably complement the video well. So we'll probably link to that from within the YouTube video description.
Let me know, William, if you want me to add that to the call to action button at the bottom too. I'm happy to drop that in.
Oh yeah, I'll just
go and put it in the chat.
I'll pop it into the chat now.
Perfect.
Oh, and it's I included an ID tag, so you're going to jump to the bottom of the page.
Perfect.
But okay, so Marie, if you don't have anything else to add, we can start to get our hands dirty here.
Let's do it.
All right, I'm gonna actually delete some of what's in place quickly so that we can build that ourselves. So fundamentally, the relation property in Notion is a method of connecting items in one database to items in another database. So here you can see that we have a database of expense categories, and then we have a database of expenses. And this database of expenses includes a type of property that most users are probably familiar with. For the category, it includes a select property. But if we were to use a relation property instead of a select property and choose the categories based on the categories available in the categories database, that's going to offer a lot more functionality that you will soon see. So the relation property can often be thought about as a way of grouping items in one database with items in another database. You can think of it as a group, as a category, as some form of classification. And oftentimes this is going to form sort of a parent-child relationship. So in this example, you've got expense categories, and this is sort of the parent and the parent-child relationship where the children are the individual expenses. Each expense will be mapped to a category using a relation property. And again, that's going to offer a lot of functionality that you'll soon appreciate. So we're looking at expense categories and individual expenses here, but you could also consider how this might work, say, for projects and their individual tasks, where projects are the parent in the relationship and their individual tasks are the children. So you could map each task to a project and use that relationship in a lot of helpful ways. Another example is recipes and their individual ingredients. You could map each ingredient to a recipe. But in that example, the parent-child relationship kind of works both ways. So you don't have to have necessarily a dedicated single item in one database and then map that to multiple items in the other. You can have multiple mappings in both databases. So in the ingredients and recipes example, you might want to view the individual ingredients within a recipe, but you might also want to view the individual recipes that all the recipes that contain an individual ingredient. If you've got, something going bad in your fridge and you want to prepare it for dinner and you need a really inspiring recipe for it, if you had this ingredients and recipes databases, you could filter your recipes database to show only the recipes that contain that particular ingredient. So this parent-child sort of relationship, this method of grouping, works both ways. So that's a lot of talk and description. Let's see exactly how it works. So let's create our first relation. We'll do that in the categories database. So just like you do with any other property, we'll add a property and we're going to name it expenses because we're going to be mapping the category to all of the individual expenses within it. And we'll choose the relation property type. And when you do that, you'll be prompted to select the database that you want to relate this database to. So we want to relate it to our expenses database. In this case, it's called simple expenses. And then click create relation. So we've created our relation property and we've linked our categories database to the expenses database. And when we do that, because this is a two-way reciprocal relationship, we automatically get a reciprocal property within the individual expenses database. So this default name is undesirable. You will rarely keep it. So we are linking these expenses back to their categories. So we can just call it category. And so now we have our reciprocal relation properties configured. The databases are connected through the relation properties, and now we can start our mapping. We can start establishing these connections between the individual items. So when you click into the relation property for an item, you're going to see all the items in the connected database. So in our Netflix subscription expense, we want to map that to our entertainment item. And it's really easy to copy and paste the linked item. So I'm going to copy that entertainment item and I'm going to paste it into our NBA ticket. And side note, that came to mind to me when I was preparing this because I had an NBA ticket prepared before the pandemic hit and I didn't get to go to the Knicks Clippers game. So that's sad. But hopefully it will be an even better game when they're back. So for the next one, we've got our weekly grocery run. That is going to be a food item. So we'll select that from our categories database, and then we'll copy and paste that to our dinner with Austin. And then finally, our mortgage is going to be a housing item. We'll select housing, and then we'll paste it also into the HOA dues. So we've now mapped each of these individual expenses to an item in the categories database. And if you click into the populated relation property, that item is going to be a link that you can click to open the database page for that item, which is going to be useful in a lot of implementations of these relation properties. You've seen Marie do that in a lot of her templates without even knowing it, probably. So what you can see that as we've added these items to the individual expenses, they've appeared in the reciprocal property within the categories database. So for each expense, we can see the linked category, but for each category, we can also see each linked expense. And if you're linking a lot of them, these rows will get pretty tall, so you'll undoubtedly want to choose to unwrap the cells. So we've established our relation properties and we've populated them. Let's see how this can be useful. So I mentioned that this forms sort of a parent-child relationship. And I would say if there's one real benefit, and there are so many benefits, but if the most useful benefit of these parent-child relationships is the ability to filter the parents or to filter the child database by the parent within the page. So that probably makes no sense explaining it. Let's see what it looks like. If we open the housing category page, what we can do is we can add a linked database. So for anyone unfamiliar, what a linked database is, it's not a new database. It's just going to show a view of an existing database. In this case, we're going to show the simple expenses database. So remember, we're within the housing expense category, and we're creating a view of the simple expenses. So when you create this linked database, it's automatically going to show all of the items in that database. And what we want to do is we want to filter this linked database to show only the items that have been mapped to the housing category. So what we'll do is we'll apply a filter, and we want to filter for that relation property that we created to choose categories, and we want to choose only the categories that contain the current one that we're editing, which is housing. So when we do that, we can see those two expenses that we mapped to the housing category. And of course, you can show and hide properties and choose, galleries and boards and whatever else that you want. But we won't get into the formatting here. What's important is that we're filtering the housing expense category to show only the children within the related database. But we're not going to want to do this for every expense category, and certainly not as we're creating new expense categories. So instead, we're going to want to create a template. I'm going to delete this linked database that we just created, and I'm going to go back out to our master expense categories database. And you may already be familiar with the process of creating a template. So you go up to the new button and click on the arrow. And I already have this created, so I'm going to delete it so we can see exactly how it's done. And I'm going to click New Template. So we're creating a template within the expense categories database. So we'll call it New Expense Category. And just as we did previously, we're going to insert a linked database, and we're going to choose that simple expenses database. So remember, previously, we filtered this database to show only the items in the housing category because we were editing the housing category. But right now, we're creating a template. So for each new category that we create with this template, we want its inner database to be filtered for that new category. So what Notion has just recently allowed us to do, this is within the past week or so, we can actually filter this database by the template. This is what's called a self-referencing filter. So we'll create the filter, we'll choose that category property, our relation property, and we want to filter to show only the expenses where the category falls within this template. So that template is now an option here, new expense category. So, of course, we don't have any existing expenses that fall within this category. This category doesn't even exist yet. It's just a template, so it's not going to show anything here. But what we've done is we've said for each new category that's created with this template, we want its inner database to show all of the expenses that are linked or related to that new category. So let me show you exactly what we mean by that. If we go back out to our master databases, we now have the option to click on that arrow again and choose new expense category. So let's call this one transportation, for example. Transportation, yeah, okay. So of course we don't have any expenses yet for transportation, but as you're editing this filtered view, if you add a new expense from within this view, it's going to be automatically related to the new transportation category. So we can just call this car payment, for example. And you can see here that the relation property has automatically been populated with transportation because we are editing it within the transportation category. And this database, this inner database, is filtered to show only the items that fall within that category. So when you add a new item, it's going to be automatically added to that category. So if we go back out to our master databases, we can see our new transportation category. We can see that car payment has been added within the linked expenses. And we can come down to our expenses database. Car payment has been added, and it's been automatically related to the transportation category. So if you think about this, not only in terms of expense tracking, but if you think about it in terms of projects and tasks, or like we said, ingredients and recipes, you can begin to get a sense of how useful this is. And you can link these categories to multiple child databases. So that presents one other benefit of using these relations versus the select properties, because if you use the same categories with multiple databases, you're going to have to create independent select properties for those categories, and you're going to have to manage them if you add or remove or rename one of those options. But if you're using relation properties instead, if you change the source of the category within that category's database, then it's going to change every instance. So if we wanted to say like food and beverage here, for example, then it's going to name all of those references to it to food and beverage. So if we had multiple databases referencing this category's database, that only allows us, that allows us only to edit it in one place, and that's going to keep your information really consistent and accurate. And it's also going to eliminate a lot of redundancy in your work.
I just wanted to bring up a related question that just popped in from Maria, which is that you cannot group relations in a board view. So there are some times where I will actually maintain the select property just for the purposes of, sometimes I like to see things in a board view. I do that with like my like product and services sales database, because I like to kind of see things by category. So sometimes I'll actually kind of leave both in there because it can be helpful to group by Kanban board.
Yeah, that's a really great point. And I would say that that's a feature, among probably my top 5, 10 that I'm most eager to see, is the ability to group a board by a relation property, because that would eliminate
be magical.
that redundancy. But also, you'll see here in a second that I would also like to be able to filter by a formula property, because formula properties can often be used for workarounds like that, and such is not the case for that particular issue. But you'll see how they can be helpful, a helpful workaround for another kind of roadblock here in a second. So let's move on. So we've seen the implementation of a relation property, reciprocal relation property. So let's look at how rollups fit into this picture. Yeah. So what a rollup does is you're able to pull in information from all of the related items. So for example, we're going to add a rollup property to the categories database, and it's going to pull in information for all of the related expenses. So let's look at exactly what I mean by that. And we'll start by adding a roll-up property. And what we're going to do is we're going to use that roll-up property to calculate the total cost for each category. So we'll name it total cost, and we'll choose the roll-up property type. And then when you click into that roll-up property for any item, you're going to make 3 specifications. You want to specify the relation property that you want to reference. So in this case, we only have one option. We've only created one relation property, which is the expenses property. And then the second option is the property within that related database that you want to pull in to this roll-up property. So in this case, we want to pull in the cost. And then for calculate, you have the ability to perform different operations on the pulled in properties. So to calculate the total cost, we want it to be the sum. So here you can see that, of course, our transportation includes 0 because we just created the car payment on a whim and we haven't assigned a value to it. But for the other ones, it's pulling in all of the costs that have been linked to this category and it's totaling them. So there you can see that, whereas we have 6 or 7 different options here, they're condensed into their categories here. And if we use the calculate feature at the bottom of the table and create the sum, you can see that it aligns with this sum here. So this is just breaking out that total spend in 2 different ways. And just because I just referenced it, let me show you what I meant by using that formula property as a workaround. When you use the sum feature at the bottom of a rollup property, you're not able to format it as a currency. And if you're already absorbing a lot of information, then just plug your ears for a second. But this is kind of helpful. If you use the a formula property to reference that rollup property, so we are going to reference total cost. You can format that as a currency. And then when you calculate the sum at the bottom, that's going to be nicely formatted. So you could just hide this one and only display the formula, and then you're going to see your nice dollars at the bottom.
We did have a couple of questions pop in that it might be good to clarify. So Jennifer was asking, when you referenced the category in the template, is there a way to do that for multiple filters at once? For example, in transportation, what if I want to filter it for transportation category, but also a second property at the same time? So, I mean, you can have multiple filters, as many filters as you want really in that database inside of your template, but you could also create multiple linked databases inside the template if you wanted to as well. But yeah, you can add more than one filter.
Yeah, you can definitely have combination filters. And in terms of the self-referencing, you're only going to be able to do that for the active template, but you can create as many other different filter conditions as you want. And I just learned recently through my own sort of tinkering that you can actually create new databases within a template and reference each other, and they will not conflict with any other instances of that template. That's getting real meta and heavy, so we won't distract everybody with that, but I was pretty excited to make that discovery. Okay, so that is our first roll-up. We've used a roll-up to pull in all of the costs associated with the linked expenses, and then we've totaled them to determine our total cost by category. So let's look at a few other instances of the roll-up, and this is not going to be quite as applicable to expenses, but this will be the most helpful way still to show you exactly how it works. So we pulled in numbers formatted as a currency in this roll-up, but roll-ups can also pull in dates, and they can pull in well, they can pull in any property, but let's look at dates. So this would make more sense or kind of be more useful in terms of our projects and tasks example, because you can use a roll-up to determine kind of like the earliest task or the next task or the full range. So if we add another roll-up here and we just call it dates and then choose the roll-up property again, and then go through that same process of picking the expenses relation. And then this time we're going to choose the date property. And when you choose a date property, you have the ability to choose the earliest date, the latest date, or the date range. So it's going to summarize all the dates that you've selected that are associated with your linked child items, and kind of present them in useful ways. So like I said, this isn't necessarily quite as applicable to expense tracking, but you can see how it would be really helpful for managing tasks and projects.
And William, just quickly, Patrick was asking, well, he said, wait, what? How is that, William Nutt? How to have them within templates? So that was your thing that you were learning when you were tinkering. I don't want to break your flow, but you were
Yeah, well, and I that's kind of a whole different topic. It's not necessarily related to relations and rollups. So to our friend who asked that question, let's connect on Twitter or elsewhere and dive into that, because I can show you an example of exactly what I'm talking about.
Cool.
Does that work?
Yeah.
Because I want to make sure we can cover all things relations and rollups here too.
So we might need a round two, like we did last time with the formulas. Might need a part two.
If this is 101, we can do a 201. So we've pulled in numbers and we've pulled in dates. You can also pull in checkboxes, and this is really cool and useful. So again, probably more applicable for tasks and projects, but still helpful to demonstrate here. So say that we wanted to add a checkbox property here just to indicate when the expense had cleared, in the bank or whatever. So we can add a checkbox property, call it cleared, and then just like check off a few of them. So then we can go in and add another roll-up property within our categories database. And we can call this %cleared. And we'll again choose roll-up. And again, choose our expenses relation. And the property this time is going to be the cleared property. So when you're pulling in checkboxes, you have the option to show you can show just like a series of them, but what's most useful is to display the % checked or unchecked. So if you think about this in terms of projects and tasks, it's wildly useful. And we'll see that in a second. So here you can see that this roll-up property has calculated the percentage of checked items among the expenses associated with each category. So if we mess around with the checked items, that percentage is going to change. So if instead we were looking at projects here and each project had a series of tasks, you could see how many tasks had been completed towards that project in order to indicate the progress of that project. So that is a really, really useful feature of these relations and rollups. So that is a very simple, well, I don't want to say very simple because it's not, the whole concept is kind of has a learning curve, but probably the simplest way to demonstrate how to use relations and rollups and kind of how they can be useful. Let's look at some kind of more advanced implementations. So I'm going to go back here and just kind of continuing our expenses. I've got some populated databases here that that include a little bit more nuance than our simple examples. So we have our expense categories again, and we have our I'm going to try not to do too much scrolling because I know Crowdcast doesn't really keep up. But we also have our expenses, and all of our expenses. So previously we were linking expenses to their categories, but we've introduced a whole nother dynamic here, and that is vendors. So in the previous example, we were just typing in the vendor name, where we spent the money. But if you're tracking expenses, you're often going to be reusing vendors frequently. And if you're real serious about seeing where your money's going, you might want to summarize your spending by vendor in addition to category. So what I've done here is added a vendors database. So this includes all of the vendors where we're spending our money. And this vendor has two relation properties. This vendor is related to the categories, the expense categories, but it's also related to the expenses. So if you look at the categories database, its only relation is to the vendors. And then the expenses are also related to the vendors. It's not directly related to the category. So by doing that, we have the ability to summarize all of our spending by vendor in the exact same way that we did with our categories. But because each vendor is related to a category, and what I did is I had to manually populate, the categories for each vendor. But having done that, what I can do is I can automatically categorize each individual expense based on the vendor using a roll-up property. So I hope that makes sense. We manually pick the vendors for each expense. We this is a relation property, and for each one, we'll click into it and we'll choose the vendor from the vendors database. But because there's already a category linked to each vendor, we can just use a roll-up property to pull in that category here, which once again eliminates redundancy, ensures accuracy, and creates consistency among all of your information. So that is a method of not having to redo your categorization and make yourself vulnerable to making mistakes. So then after doing that, we can use another roll-up property within categories still to summarize spending by category. So I know that this is, if you're me, I wouldn't grasp this right here, in 5 minutes or whatever. But as you work with this and practice it on your own, it'll click for you for sure. And this gives you the ability in just kind of a few simple streamlined steps to summarize your expenses by category, to summarize them by vendor, through these relations and roll-ups without having to do a bunch of duplicate work. So this is kind of like a grandparent-parent-child relationship, if you're thinking about it in that sort of hierarchy. Yeah. So what I've also done here is I've created a database of months. And you'll see, I think, a lot in Marie's examples and videos and tutorials. She creates like days and months or quarters, particularly like for OKRs, for example. You'll create like quarterly items within a quarters database. And so here I've assigned a month to each expense. We've related the expenses to the months, and that allows us not only to determine our total spending by category and vendor, but also by month. And the reason that this is helpful is because it allows us to use the average feature at the bottom of this database, so you can see your average spending per month. And again, this is ugly formatting, so we would use that little formula trick to format that average at the bottom of the month's database.
And for any, business owners or self-employed folks, this is kind of how I track sales per category, right? So retainer clients, one-off clients, products that you sell, just being able to track that stuff really easily on a monthly basis and to look for patterns and, what months, do I sell more of this than that? It's just, whether you use it for expenses or for sales, there's just a lot of, I think, interesting different ways you could apply these principles.
Yeah. It can be, if you have kind of these periods of reflection built into all of your tracking, it can be really, really enlightening, as Marie discusses. So I mentioned projects and tasks as we were walking through those preliminary examples. So I do have some examples of that built out here for us to, again, not do step by step, but just to review how it can be useful. So actually I have, in addition to projects and tasks, I also have a clients database and a resources database. So if you look at a lot of the methodologies that are recommended by those of us who publish this content about Notion, you'll see that a lot of these sort of methodologies incorporate some sort of variation of clients or areas, as the para method would call it, and then projects, and then within those projects, tasks, and then resources for the items and materials that you reference for your projects and tasks. So, for example, I've got this bulletproof methodology on Notion VIP that is kind of an adaptation of para specifically for Notion. And then August Bradley, who has emerged as just an incredible resource for all things Notion, has his own sort of adaptation he calls pillars, pipelines, and vaults. But ultimately, they all include kind of some sort of variation of an areas database, in this case, clients, and then projects, tasks, and resources. So I have those 4 databases here. We have clients, we have projects, we have tasks, which are the steps towards completing projects, and then we have resources. So with you can see that our clients have 2 relation properties. Each client is related to projects, or maybe in simpler terms, each project is mapped to one client. And then each resource is going to be mapped to a client as well. So then what you can do is, just as we did with expenses and our expense categories, within clients, you have the ability to open the page and see linked filtered views of the projects and resources database. So you can see here that this projects database shows only the projects that have been related to this particular client, which is Blue Ribbon Restaurants, which I miss a lot. It's my favorite restaurant family in New York. And it's displayed as a board based on kind of where it is in the production cycle. So it can be in progress, planned, or complete. And again, this is filtered to show only those projects that have been related to this particular client. And the same is true for resources. We're showing only the resources that are related to this particular client. And again, I won't walk through it again, but you can create a template that configures these linked databases to include the new client automatically. So you don't have to manually configure that, as we were all doing just 3 weeks ago.
And I think on that note too, I know a lot of people sometimes say like, oh, like it takes so long to like, how do people get work done? Like I've heard that comment, but I don't think people maybe understand the full magic of templates. Like once you set up the template once, it's so much faster to spin up those projects, but it does take that upfront work. And so, yeah, I just think people need to take advantage of the templates.
Yeah, that's really important to reinforce, because I'm actually actively working with a business now, helping them to configure their workspace. And they're kind of like, this is a lot of work. They're like, there's a lot of time going to this. And I have to continuously underscore for them that we're just building the infrastructure for this at this point. And once it's in place, it's totally streamlined. So, the idea behind a template is that just in a couple of quick clicks, you can create a new client that automatically includes these nice filtered views of its associated projects. And then, so the same is true for a project. If we open up a project, we can see a nice filtered view of the tasks that are related to that project. This one is displayed as a list. It shows its deadline. It shows the person that it's assigned to. And then it's got that checkbox property. So this is an instance where it's helpful to use that roll up that pulls in checkboxes and calculates the percent completed. Because if we go back to our projects database, we see Blue Ribbon website 2.0. We have 57.1% of our checkboxes, of our tasks have been completed. So that is kind of a more applicable example of where that checkbox oriented rollup can be useful. So that's it. I know it's a lot. And again, you can, you'll have the recording of this webcast as well as that published post on Notion VIP to take this kind of one step at a time. But I hope that sort of simpler example, that simpler demonstration, allowed you to grasp these concepts. And then these kind of more advanced, examples showed you kind of how powerful they can be.
Yeah, let us know in the chat. I know a lot of folks were, I think, pretty stoked about the roll-ups and understanding how that works. So I think there was a lot of clarity there. Some questions have popped in. So why don't we, someone said, so the first step might be to create a template. Yeah, if you've got, I mean, obviously there's some amount of building needed first, sort of like just to get those initial templates in place, figure out which ones you need. But yeah, I often will kind of start with the template, and that's where I'll do a lot of my practicing, if you will, because it's a lot easier to start with a template than to move your data and recreate that stuff inside your template. So I don't know if you have anything to add there.
Yeah, I just, in terms of, a lot of preparing your Notion workspace, it's always going to be evolving and refining based on, new information and new methodologies that you come to understand and updates to, Notion itself. But you still kind of want to start with as much of a plan as possible from the beginning. So what I do even before creating a template is I'll kind of populate it for a real client or a real area or a real project. So I know exactly what I want that template to include, because if you're thinking in hypotheticals, it's easy to kind of be manipulated. But if you build it out for that Blue Ribbon Restaurants client, like really include the projects and the resources that you want associated and with it, and then format it in the way that's going to be most useful, then you can easily just pop that over into the template.
Yeah, I think that's a great point. And I think a lot of people want to get their space right when they just start, but I always encourage people, treat it like a bit of a sandbox. You're only going to figure out what you need once you've gotten in there and kind of played with some of that data and figure out what's useful for you. And what's useful for one person is overkill for another person. So you kind of have to just jump in a little bit and like you said, do it with a real project and figure out what you need.
Yeah, and that's always the caveat with these webcasts too, because we have such a variation in the skill level and the experience of users that for some of you, I know that this will be drinking through a fire hose, and for others, it may be slow paced and elementary. So the idea here is to offer as much information as possible without making it overwhelming. But I do always underscore, you'll have that recording to reference afterwards, because the best way to grasp these concepts is to apply it to your real life workspaces.
Absolutely. Maybe unrelated, is it advisable to create individual databases or multiple databases within a page? Sorry for the naive question asking, since I'm new to Notion. I'll be interested to hear your point of view on this.
It's not a naive question. That's a question that all of us grapple with all the time. And there's really just a lot of considerations to make, because there are, my default is to use master databases and then filtered views of it as much as possible. But in a lot of circumstances, that is not ideal, because, for example, if you're using a template, and if you have a template, say, for a website production project, and you know that every website production project is going to include 10 tasks, ideally, you'd want each of your projects to include filtered views of a master tasks database. However, if you create a template for a website project, you're not going to be able to populate those new website projects automatically with those 10 tasks. And again, this is easier demonstrated than explained. But if you kind of think through that on your own, you'll see how there's trade-offs. So my default is to use master databases, consolidate as much as possible into master databases, and then use linked views of it. But in a lot of circumstances, you're going to need to break them out into their own individual databases within those pages. And that really is a good question, and one that we all grapple with pretty frequently.
Yeah, there's a couple, like core databases that I sort of think every space sort of needs. And like you said, there's like the resources, the projects, what have you. And then I tend to make like contextual dashboards. So it'll be like my gardening dashboard that has all of the databases I need inside the one page so that I'm not clicking around. Me personally, I like to minimize the amount that I'm clicking and sort of removing myself from seeing all the information in one place. But I still think you kind of need those like core master databases that you can pull into your pages. So I think the more you use Notion, the more you can make that. Does this need to be in a page? Does it need to be in a database? I think when you're playing, like how you had your expenses all in one page, when you're playing, I think it's actually a lot easier to kind of see it all in one page, manipulating the data, almost like a sandbox page.
Yeah, and one other point about that is you want to consider the end user as well, because a lot of these questions, that's kind of the foremost consideration is kind of the skill level and the comfort level of the end user. So like for Marie and I, we might integrate some of these kind of more advanced features because we've built it from scratch. We know exactly how it works and how, when it comes to like repeating tasks and like these different functionalities, we know exactly what manual steps are involved for updating that date after you complete it or duplicating the task or whatever's involved. Whereas a lot of the users that we work with, they want to, as Marie said, have as few steps as possible, have to understand it as minimally as possible, want it to be completely intuitive, in which case, that will inform one decision over the other when it comes to how to separate databases. Definitely.
And some of these questions might be repeats. We might have covered this because they did pop in earlier, but would a rollup be used to gain access? Would a rollup be used to gain a progress bar? One thing I haven't checked out how to do on Notion as yet. I mean, we did kind of talk about progress bars, so I think we've sort of already covered that.
Well, we talked about percentages, but speaking of our Formulas 201 session, we demonstrated very in great detail exactly how to create a visual progress bar. So definitely, now that you understand rollups, because we didn't really dive into rollups in that session, we actually mentioned that we would be covering it another time. Yeah. So here we are covering it. Now you can go back to the progress bar episode. I think it was Full Formulas circle. 201, and that'll show you exactly how to merge what we've learned today in rollups with the formulas that we use to create those progress bars.
Can rollups be used in formulas?
So I'm not sure. I mean, you can reference the value that a rollup creates. That's exactly what we did when we reformatted to be able to use that currency formatting at the bottom. All we did is used a formula to reference that rollup property. And then once we did that, we were able to use the currency formatting at the bottom of the database. So yes, you can reference the value that the final value of a rollup property. It can be tricky because sometimes with rollups, you'll just pull in each value and it'll display it as a list, which I think technically within a formula is going to translate as a string, a text string. So you might, if you have like a list of numbers, for example, that could get a little confusing for you. But the simple answer to your question is yes, you can reference the values of a rollup property within your formulas.
SJ is asking, is it possible, could you show us a way of doing a rollup on a rollup? I actually don't think you can do a rollup on a rollup, can you?
So I actually don't think you can either. That's a good question. And if you try to roll up a roll up, I think the values are going to be blank. I'm not positive, but let's explore that together.
He did. They did elaborate. I have 3 relational databases, let's say A, B, and C. I've roll up A into database B, but I'm not able to get this roll up into database B as a roll up into database C. And I've done that with formulas too, where like I'm pulling in my monthly revenue is rolling up, but I'm actually pulling in the formula, which is giving it the currency. Like, so there are some kind of workarounds. Like,
yeah, same workaround. You can't choose a rollup property to roll up within a rollup, but what you can do is you can create, just like we did for the currencies, you can write a formula, and all it is a reference to the rollup property, and then you can roll up that formula, which is exactly what Marie was just saying.
A bit of a workaround, but yeah. Okay, so that's a great question. Is there a way to give weight to checkboxes? For example, if you know stage 2 of 4 accounts for 50% of the overall work. So, for example, in your checkboxes, we're kind of treating them as though they're equal importance, but they're not necessarily. And so I imagine you'd have to give a different property, and you'd have to be using an advanced formula to weight the properties differently. So it wouldn't be the same way we've done it with the checkboxes.
Well, you could, it would probably be helpful to separate it into individual properties, but you could actually do it all within a formula. So natively, you're not able to give weight to individual checkboxes, but you could use a formula that includes, like multiplication and add 1 and then add up the total. I'd have to think through it. But yeah, I mean, it's definitely possible with a formula.
Or even like size property, right? It could be like, what's the appetite of this task, or what's the size of this task? And you could, if it's this, give it a weight of 4, 3, like you could kind of, yeah.
Yeah, and then you would just like add up your sum, your weighted sum.
Yeah. So it's tricky. It's like with anything in Notion, sometimes it's like, it can't do that natively, but you can totally build a thing that does that. It just takes a little bit of creative wizardry and understanding how formulas work. Okay, so if you use this method and change something in your notes, it will be updated everywhere. I think that was related to when you were like changing the name of the category to like, food and beverage. If you change it there, it will update it everywhere that you have referenced that. And the fun thing too, one of
the biggest advantages to this is, again, I get back to kind of like the highest level advantages is to streamline your workspace, and that's going to eliminate redundancy. It's going to ensure that everything is accurate and consistent, because the more manual entry that you're doing, the more work you're doing, and the more you're setting yourself up to make a mistake as well. And then also, manual entry is going to eliminate the ability to pull all of your information together and slice it and dice it in useful ways as well.
Definitely. And one thing I love too is when you @mention a page, right? So you can like @mention any database entry or any page title. And then if you change that page title, that actually changes that reference of it, which is kind of nice too. Okay, so a relation basically accesses the property of another database, while a rollup lets you access any property within the said database. Sort of. So yeah, a relation accesses the other database. The rollup accesses the properties of those databases. Hopefully that makes.
Yeah, a relation accesses the item, so you can just click on the item and open it as a page. And then a rollup, yes, pulls in the values of other properties for that item.
Great. And then random question, would you work with clients in your personal Notion or make a separate workspace? I've heard it both ways, I'm pretty sure. I have my own opinions on this. I'd be happy to hear, William, your approach, how you've been doing.
Yeah, it's and that kind of gets back to a bigger point about all of this, and that is that every Notion workspace is, the beauty of Notion is that it balances, in my opinion, flexibility with like a minimal design and it's just the right amount of infrastructure so that you can't like waste your time or go too far down a rabbit hole necessarily, but it's also flexible with all of these different features. So with that flexibility comes the ability to adapt every workspace to your specific needs. So for all of these methods and all of the advice that we offer, none of it is written in stone. The idea is just to grasp these kind of core principles and then adapt them to your unique needs. So in some cases, it's not going to be an issue to merge your personal work with your client work. It will be advantageous to have it all together because consolidation is kind of my foremost rule of thumb. I love to keep things as consolidated and centralized as possible. At the same time, I'm pretty crazy about not blending my personal work or my personal life with my work life. So I keep mine separate, but I know Marie and a lot of your examples, we're getting a glimpse into to what you're doing with your gardening and everything. So it's really specific to the user.
Yeah, and when I was first working with clients inside of Notion, what I would do is I created a client portal that lived inside the project. And so I could do what I needed to do inside the project, but the client would only see what was inside the client portal. And so over time, as I kind of figured out the best way to work with clients and invite them in only to key pages, I started creating my client's own master task databases, master resources, etc. So initially I was kind of managing the tasks inside my own master task database, but you cannot share a filtered view of your master task databases with other people. So I started to create my little client workspaces inside my projects. Then as the clients got more comfortable and familiar with Notion, they were like, this tool's amazing. I want to sign up for my own account. And I would actually load those templates. And in many cases, if the client has given me admin privileges, I was able to Command-Shift-P, literally move all of our work into their workspace in like one click. So there was no rebuilding that needed to happen. I was able to move all of that data in, and then they had a starting point to work with their own workspace. So it kind of depends. Not all clients are comfortable or have their own Notion workspace at the beginning, but if you give them a bit of a starting point, you can make that a lot easier. So I have quick links inside my space that kind of take me to those workspaces, and I also pull in their master task databases from their workspaces into my sort of client task dashboards. So I can kind of see it in my space, but it's not natively in my space, if that makes sense. So there's ways you can kind of work around like how much you want to keep it in your space versus how much to kind of do externally. So it is really up to you. I think that partially also depends how many clients are you working with any one given time. Yeah, how many people do you want to be inviting to your space? It can get a little dangerous, but that's very much personal preference. Cool. That's it for the questions that popped in. Did anyone else want to ask any questions? I don't know, anything else you want to get into? I mean, I like relations and rollups are definitely one of my favorite features, and I know most of my templates rely pretty heavily on them. My daily journal is something that when I fill out that journal every single day, that gets all of those properties get rolled up into my weekly agenda. So I can see what words did I use to describe the day, what was my effectiveness, what was my happiness, what was I grateful for, and then I sort of have this like beautiful weekly report that kind of pulls in all that data. And I really love how easy that is to do. Could you show?
That gets back to the importance of having reflection time, whether it's weekly or monthly or quarterly. But you do all this tracking, you want to be sure to give it its due time for kind of analyzing it and seeing how it can benefit you.
I'm going to do a super, super quick screen share of that because Maria did just ask. And I think the weekly agenda is one of my favorite use cases. Can you see my screen here? I guess I need to focus here. Let me know if you can. Just a sec. There we go. I might zoom in here too, just so you can let me know if you can see that okay.
Yep.
Cool. So you can see I'm using quite a few rollups in my weekly agenda. So this is pulling in all of the win the day tasks from my daily journal, the knowledge hub too. All of this stuff pulls in from my daily journal, effectiveness, words that were used. So this is for next week, for example. So let's say if on Monday I say, yes, I had flow state, I won the day, I did my win the day task, I was anxious, proud, angry,
romantic,
feeling romantic today, energy level, high energy, right? And this takes 5 minutes to fill in, right? So people sometimes give me a hard time and they sort of say like, how do you get any work done? This is a template I've built. I've been using it for so long. It's really easy for me to do this. This is great, right? And I go through, I fill all of this out. It's all templated. Entertainment, right? There's my Netflix category. I could add up my expenses for that. So when I close that up, you'll see that starts to populate up here, right? So there's the words that I use, there's the effectiveness, this is great. Even the sales database is connected up. So by the end of the week, I've got this beautiful report. And then what I do here too is this is my weekly planner, but when I switch the week to review, that actually shows the picture of the day. And so then that becomes a report versus a plan. So it's kind of like a nice different view of the same data. Cool, a bunch of questions popped in. I noticed you had a category for recurring tasks in one of your task views. I know we're like at the hour, so I feel like we might need to kind of defer some of those questions, especially as if the questions are around task management.
And we also will send a follow-up survey, and in that survey is an opportunity for you to make requests for future topics. So whether that's when I come back or when Marie's coordinating her other guests, don't get into too much of a panic if we can't address your question here. Because this is an ongoing conversation. We're always working through, working with everyone as they're getting a handle on all of this.
And I think this was like a really great intro session. And, a lot of people have been asking like, oh, I'd love to see more examples in context. And so I think maybe there is a 201 or a next level version of let's show some more, whether it's project-based, sprint planning, weekly agenda, there might be room to just do a bit more of an advanced relations and roll-up situation so people can see what it looks like in real workspaces.
Yeah, that's perfect. I mean, that's kind of the approach we took with formulas, where we started pretty elementary and then got into some really specific examples, including those visual progress bars. So I think that's a great idea.
That'd be a good one. Yeah, great. So I know we're at the hour. A couple questions have still popped in, but we'll. I guess what's the best way for people to probably reach out to us on Twitter to suggest any future sessions or ask questions, right?
Yeah, I mean, I'd say the Twitter is a great place to continue the conversation. But in that survey, I look really closely at the responses to that survey and the recommendations that you make there. I actually have another webcast called Notion at Work. It's more like specific to team uses of Notion. And so the Notion team and I maintain a running list of topics that we could never get all the way through, but we prioritize them based on how frequently they're recommended in those surveys. So let us know what you want to see in upcoming episodes, and then the more that we see it suggested and requested, the higher the priority it will be, and we'll make it happen. But certainly feel free to communicate with us on Twitter in the interim.
Yeah. Awesome. And again, I've linked to the resources at the bottom here, resources from this session to take you to that article that William's got on the power of relations and rollups. There's going to be a recording of this on YouTube. You can always come back here to the same URL and watch it here if you want. And I think that's it for today. But William, thank you so much. This was such a great introduction. I think a lot of people's minds were blown in terms of what they can do with rollups. So.
Well, that's good, but I hope not overwhelmed, because it's tough to balance how much information you offer, but also like make sure that everyone can still kind of get a grasp. But ultimately, nothing's more useful than actually getting your hands dirty and applying these concepts to your own information. So I thoroughly encourage you to do that.
Awesome. Go forth and roll up, everybody. Have a wonderful weekend. Thanks so much, William.
Thank you all.
Bye for now.